First off, I'd like to talk about some of the signs and symptoms of autism spectrum disorder so you can identify them and possibly put the rest of this video into practice. A person with autism spectrum disorder, it usually comes about between 1 and 3 years. Very early signs is they might not respond to their own name within 12 months. They might not play pretend. When they're very young, they might want to be alone. They will have trouble understanding other people's feelings or talking about their own feelings. They often have delayed speech and language skills in early development. They often repeat phrases over and over again. They give unrelated answers to questions when they're asked. For example, if a teacher asks, does anybody have any questions? The student might say, what's a good name for a hamster when you're talking about driver's ed? They're not doing this to be funny. They're doing it because they're actually literally answering the question that you asked. They might be upset by minor changes. They also could have obsessive interests. So everybody has interests, and as people develop and get older, sometimes they develop quirks, I guess you could say. But often it's seen. They also might flap their hands or rock their body or spin in circles. This is known as stimming or stimulation. It's a form of self-soothing, so it's something to look out for. They might also have unusual reactions to the way things sound, smell, taste, look, or feel. Now, the biggest concern with us interacting with people with autism spectrum disorder is how do we teach them? One of the barriers to effective teaching is a change in social skills that is experienced when somebody has autism spectrum disorder. For example, they avoid eye contact. They prefer to play alone. They do not share interests, common interests that other people have. They only interact to achieve a desired goal, whatever their goal is. They have flat or inappropriate facial expressions for whatever the situation is going on. They often don't understand personal space boundaries, so the personal space envelope that we have in society, though it's different in different countries, often isn't understood easily by people with autism spectrum disorder. They often avoid or resist physical contact of any form because it's unappealing. Even if it's a touch on the hand when they're driving the car, that might affect them more than it would another person. Also, when they're in distress, often it's more difficult for them to be comforted by others. And they also have difficulty talking about their own feelings or understanding other people's feelings. They can also be very blatant. For example, if your breath smells, they'd be more willing to mention that your breath smells. And they don't mean judgment in this. They're just telling you that's what the situation is. So if you have an individual that displays some of these characteristics, there's a chance that they also have autism spectrum disorder. So these are things to look out for. These aren't all of the symptoms and signs, but it gives you a good indication of where to start when you're concerned about someone and figuring out how best to teach them. It's about teaching students on the autism spectrum. It's known as autism spectrum disorder. And tips that I learned there that I'm going to share with you, hopefully in a compressed format. This does not count for continuing education credits. However, the more we know, the better we are. Right? That's the job. So, first off, what is autism spectrum disorder? Previously, it was okay to say someone had autism. That's gone out of favor somewhat. It's now reasonable to say that they're on the spectrum. Now, what does that mean? We're all on the spectrum in one way or another. For example, if you are very conscious of how loud noises are, and if, like, when music's too loud, it actually hurts your ears. Or when material is scratchy, you don't want to wear the shirt, or the feeling of water is something that offends you or bothers you more than it bothers your significant other, for example. That's one of the things that, like, there's a bit of autism in all of us, and realizing what's going on with us is going to give us a better idea of what potentially could be going on with a student when we're interacting with them. Now, what are some tips for dealing with somebody that has autism spectrum disorder? One of them is communication. Communicating with the parents, first and foremost, to find out how you can best teach their son or daughter is super helpful. The more communication you have with the parents, the more effective that communication is, the better chance you have of being successful with the son or daughter when they're doing what they're doing. Now, what concerns do we have when we're working with somebody with autism? One of the concerns that we have in people with autism is they need more time for transitions than normal students do. So let me unpack that for a little bit. People with autism are normal. They are just part of the spectrum of people. So to say normal is not politically correct anymore. However, we're going to make mistakes as we learn things. I just made a mistake. It's important to recognize that, especially if you're talking to somebody whose parents have a child that is on the spectrum. It's okay to make mistakes. Just realize that you've made the mistake and then move on. So transitions are difficult, not just in this video, but also for people on the spectrum. What can you do? You can prepare the student by giving them ample time for those transitions. If it's in a classroom setting, giving a good idea to all the students of what's going to happen. Say we're going to go an hour on video, and then we're going to have a 5-minute break, and then we're going to do another hour, and then we're going to have a 5-minute break. Giving this information right up front makes it easier for them. What else can you do? Create a checklist for driving. I have an instructor, Michael Hancher, who creates a launch list. So it's basically a list of procedures that you have to follow before you can launch, before you can drive the car. A good example of this would be, before you put your seatbelt on, you need to move the car seat forward and backwards so you don't cut yourself in half when you're trying to move the seat. And then what would you do next? After that, after your seatbelt is on, then you can turn the key on. You need to turn the key in order to make the electric mirrors work. If you have a checklist of these things, somebody on the spectrum is going to have a better time transitioning from one step to the next and also being successful. Knowing the individual is extremely important. Probably the most important part of teaching in general is knowing the specific situation that the student is in and how you can best teach them. Also, having various levels, or recognizing the student's levels of anxiety, and also tailoring what you're teaching to that moment. Now, we do this with everyone. However, with people that have autism, because one of the difficulties is them picking up on social cues, you need to be fully aware of what's going on with them to make them successful. Another good idea would be to don't use no. For example, instead of saying don't do this, you should say do this. So as you're approaching dealing with things in black and white is very, very helpful with people with autism. However, there's always aberrations. For example, at a 4-way intersection, we know, given the right-of-way laws, who is supposed to go first. If you have explained this well to the student with the people on the spectrum, that when they get to an intersection and someone doesn't follow that rule, it's going to be very difficult for them to figure out what's going on with that. So when someone else doesn't follow the rule, it's helpful to say, oh, that guy in the blue truck, he decided to go. But that is not the rule, is it? Right? But we still have to be able to drive down the road smoothly, so we can deal with that. What else? When you're talking to the parents, when you're communicating with the parents, it might be a good idea to bring up the idea of an autism card. Basically, what it is a small card they can have on their person with their license and registration. So if they do get pulled over in the future, they can hand with their license and registration a card to the police officer that says, I am on the spectrum, and because of that, eye contact is difficult, or because of that, I might interact differently than the last person you pulled over. It's not because I'm on drugs, it's because I'm on the spectrum, and here's some information about that. That can be extremely helpful for making it easier for the police officer and also the person getting pulled over. Another thing when you're interacting with individuals on the spectrum is outside distractions are a larger cause for concern. So reducing those. In some situations that might mean putting on very low music. Some situations mean no music whatsoever. I'm talking in the car here. Also asking the individual student what bothers them and then avoiding that. Silence in the car can be golden. So telling the student what they're expected, and then allowing the student to carry out the action. Often, as drivers and instructors, we speak. Some of us just prattle on about all sorts of stuff because it does calm the student down most situations. That may not be the case if the person is on the spectrum. Let's see, what else did I learn here? Breaking routine. When something happens that is out of the ordinary, it is going to take, as I mentioned, more time for the interaction or for the transition to sink in and see what happens. So if you see a situation developing on the road and there's enough time to pull over to the side of the road and talk about what's going to happen, it's more likely for that student to be successful in that situation. Another thing that you should do when you're doing that is talk about how you as a unit are going to solve this problem. We're in this together. We'll figure it out. We'll talk about it, and then afterwards, remind the student of what they did well in that situation. Now, obviously, driving is a dynamic environment. We cannot control everything that happens, and there's a chance that the student on the autism spectrum will not be able to be a successful driver. But that is not where we're starting. We're starting with, we can teach every student that has the ability, and we're going to work on that the best we can. Another thing that could help is a schedule of interactions. For example, after your first drive with them, there's things that you're going to do in the second drive. To give them a heads up what those are is very helpful. So say like you're on your second drive, you're going to work on four-way stops or four-way intersections and parallel parking. Telling them the time before they drive that they're going to be doing that will be very helpful. Another thing that would be helpful would be if you make an appointment with them, write it on the back of a business card. Just speaking to somebody that has autism spectrum doesn't always, so they might understand it, they might hear it, but it might just go right through. As we know as educators, there's all sorts of different modalities, and trying to reach the modality that's most effective for them is very helpful. So generally when you're driving with a student, if you make another appointment, you might just say it, have the student pull out their phone and type it in their phone. It might be beneficial that's when someone has the spectrum or someone's on the spectrum to take out a business card and write what the appointment was and then hand that card to the individual before they get out of the car. So in general, that's a lot of the things that I learned in the meeting, and I just wanted to share them with you in this short format so you'd have an idea of how to interact with people when you recognize that they are on the spectrum. Thank you for your time.